Quiet mornings, finding calm in the chaos of the world. In the tender hours before the world awakens, we discover not just peace, but ourselves. Introduction. The sacred hour. There exists a time each day when the world holds its breath. It arrives quietly, without fanfare, in those precious moments before dawn fully breaks, when darkness loosens its grip, but daylight has not yet claimed the sky. This is the sacred hour, a threshold between night's dreams and day's demands, where possibility lives in the spaces between heartbeats. I discovered this truth not in books or teachings, but in the gradual awakening of my own mornings. It began during a particularly turbulent season of my life, when sleep became elusive and anxiety wore grooves in my thoughts like water carving stone. Rising before necessity demanded it seemed counterintuitive. Surely rest was what I needed most. Yet something drew me from bed in those early hours, a whispered invitation I couldn't quite name. What I found in those first tentative mornings was not immediately transformative. There was no sudden enlightenment, no dramatic shift in consciousness. Instead, there was something far more valuable: space. Space to breathe without urgency, to think without interruption, to simply exist without the weight of expectation. In this space, I began to understand that quiet mornings are not merely a luxury for the leisured, but a necessity for the soul seeking equilibrium in an increasingly chaotic world. The morning I truly understood this power, I was standing at my kitchen window, coffee steaming in my hands, watching the sky blush from deep purple to soft rose. The neighborhood lay in perfect stillness, no cars rushing past, no phones demanding attention, no voices calling from other rooms. In that moment, I felt something I hadn't experienced in months: peace. Not the absence of problems, but the presence of something larger than my troubles. The morning had created a sanctuary, and I was both its keeper and its guest. This book is an invitation into that sanctuary. It is not a manual for productivity or a guide to morning optimization. It is something quieter, more essential, a meditation on the profound gift that awaits us in the early hours, and how these gentle rituals can become the foundation for a more balanced, centered life. In our modern world, we have become strangers to silence, refugees from solitude. We wake to alarms that jolt us into consciousness, immediately reaching for devices that flood our minds with information, obligations, and the overwhelming weight of everything that needs our attention. We have forgotten the ancient wisdom of gradual awakening, of allowing consciousness to emerge like dawn itself, slowly, naturally, with reverence for the transition from rest to activity. Quiet mornings offer us a different way. They teach us that the day need not begin with chaos, that we can choose how we enter each new cycle of light. They remind us that before we give ourselves to the world's demands, we must first return to ourselves. In the stillness of early morning, we remember who we are, beneath all the roles we play, all the responsibilities we carry, all the noise that usually fills our days. Chapter 1. The Language of Dawn. Dawn speaks in a language older than words, written in gradients of light across the canvas of sky. To understand this language, we must first learn to listen with more than our ear. We must attune ourselves to the subtle symphony of awakening that plays out each morning, regardless of whether we are present to witness it. The first lesson dawn teaches us is patience. Light does not arrive all at once, blazing and demanding attention. Instead, it seeps slowly into the world, touching the horizon with the faintest suggestion of change. The darkness doesn't flee in panic. It retreats gracefully, sharing the sky with growing light in a dance of transition that lasts for precious minutes or hours, depending on the season and our willingness to observe. I remember the first morning I truly watched this transition unfold. I had risen earlier than usual, not by choice, but because worry had made sleep impossible. Rather than lying in bed wrestling with anxious thoughts, I wrapped myself in a blanket and stepped onto my back porch. The world was dressed in that deep blue that exists only in the hour before sunrise, when night and day negotiate their daily exchange. As I sat there, something remarkable happened. The horizon began to glow, so subtly that I wasn't sure if I was imagining it. A faint line of pearl-colored light appeared where the earth met sky, growing almost imperceptibly brighter. I found myself holding my breath, afraid that any movement might disturb this delicate process. Minutes passed, or perhaps it was only seconds. Time moves differently in the presence of such beauty, and the light spread upward like spilled water, tinting the clouds with coral and gold. What struck me most profoundly was the silence that accompanied this transformation. The light arrived without sound, without announcement, with a humility that seemed almost sacred. Here was one of the most magnificent daily miracles on our planet, and it happened in perfect quiet, asking nothing of us but our attention. This is the first gift that quiet mornings offer. They teach us to witness beauty without needing to possess it, to experience wonder without demanding explanation. Dawn comes regardless of our presence, yet when we choose to be there, something alchemical occurs. We become participants in the world's awakening rather than mere observers of our own hurried lives. The language of dawn varies with the seasons, each offering its own vocabulary of light and shadow. Spring mornings arrive with a freshness that seems to cleanse the air itself, carrying the promise of new growth in the warming breeze. The light of these dawns has a green quality to it, as if filtered through young leaves not yet unfurled. There is an eagerness in spring mornings, a sense of potential barely contained. Summer dawns come earlier and with more confidence, the sun rising with the assurance of long, warm days ahead. The light is golden from the first moment it touches the horizon, painting everything with the patina of abundance. These mornings smell of grass and possibility, of windows thrown open, and the promise of evening thunderstorms hours away. Autumn mornings carry a different, weight not heavy but substantial, like a book whose pages have been touched by many hands. The light has a crystalline quality, sharp and clear, revealing details that summer's hazy warmth had softened. There is a poignancy to autumn dawns, a beauty made more precious by its impermanence. The air carries scents of transformation, leaves releasing their green grip on summer, earth preparing for rest. Winter mornings speak in whispers. The light arrives reluctantly, pale and careful, as if testing the world's readiness for day. But there is profound beauty in winter's restraint, in the way morning light catches on frost or gleams off snow, transforming the familiar landscape into something otherworldly. Winter dawns teach us that beauty doesn't always announce itself with fanfare. Sometimes it arrives in silver and silence, requiring us to look more carefully to find its gifts. Learning dawn's language requires more than observation. It demands presence. We must resist the urge to photograph, to document, to immediately share. Dawn's language is written in the moment, and it fades the instant we try to capture it. The true magic lies not in preserving the experience, but in allowing it to change us, to become part of our inner landscape rather than another image on our phones. There is something profoundly healing about witnessing the daily birth of light. In a world that often feels chaotic and unpredictable, dawn offers reliability. No matter what chaos filled yesterday, no matter what uncertainties tomorrow might hold, the sun will rise, light will return, the world will begin again. This reliability becomes an anchor for the soul seeking balance. When our minds are spinning with worry about things beyond our control, when the future feels uncertain and the past feels heavy, we can return to this fundamental truth. Morning always comes. Light always returns. The earth continues its ancient dance with the sun, indifferent to our troubles, yet somehow, mysteriously, offering comfort through its constancy. In those early moments of watching dawn unfold, we begin to understand our place in something larger than ourselves. We are not separate from this daily miracle, but part of it. The same light that touches the horizon touches our faces. The same air that carries the scent of dew fills our lungs. We are not observers standing outside the natural world. We are participants in its endless cycle of rest and renewal. This participation doesn't require elaborate ritual or spiritual practice, though these can certainly deepen the experience. Sometimes the most profound connection comes simply from showing up, from being present, to witness the day's gentle beginning. We don't need to understand the science of sunrise or the mechanics of atmospheric light to be moved by its beauty. We need only to be there, open and receptive, allowing dawn's quiet language to speak to something deeper than intellect. The transformation that occurs during these morning encounters is subtle but profound. We begin to carry something of dawn's patience within us throughout the day. When faced with frustration or impatience, we remember the gentle way light spreads across the sky. When confronted with abrupt changes or harsh transitions, we recall the graceful dance between darkness and day. Dawn becomes not just something we witness, but something we embody, a quality of presence we can access, even in the midst of afternoon chaos. This is perhaps the deepest gift of learning dawn's language. It teaches us about our own capacity for renewal. Just as each morning brings fresh light, regardless of yesterday's storms, we too possess the ability to begin again, to start each day with the possibility of transformation. The sun doesn't rise grudgingly, carrying the weight of yesterday's clouds. It rises fully, completely, offering its light without reservation or condition. Dawn reminds us that beginnings are not just possible, but inevitable. Each morning is proof that endings are never final, that darkness is always temporary, that no matter how long the night has been, light will return. In a world that often emphasizes permanence and finality, dawn offers the revolutionary message of constant renewal, of endless opportunities to begin again. Chapter 2. Rituals of Stillness. The word ritual often conjures images of elaborate ceremonies or religious practices, but the most powerful rituals are often the simplest, small acts performed with intention and attention, repeated until they become sacred through their very repetition. Morning rituals are not about complicated procedures or exotic practices. They are about creating containers for stillness, spaces where peace can take root and grow. My own morning rituals evolved slowly, organically, like a path worn smooth by countless footsteps. They began not as conscious choices, but as desperate measures during a time when anxiety ruled my days. I would wake in the pre-dawn darkness, heart racing with worries about work, relationships, the state of the world, all the concerns that seem magnified in the vulnerable hours between sleep and full consciousness. Initially, I tried to combat these anxious mornings with activity. I would leap from bed and immediately busy myself with tasks, hoping that productivity might outrun worry. But productivity, I learned, is not the enemy of anxiety. Often it becomes anxiety's favorite accomplice, giving our restless minds more things to manage and control. The first ritual that found me was the simple act of making coffee with intention. Instead of the hurried brewing that had once marked my mornings rushing to get caffeine into my system as quickly as possible, I began to slow down the process. I would measure the coffee carefully, listening to the beans rustle into the grinder. I would pay attention to the aroma that filled the kitchen as the machine worked its magic. I would pour the water slowly, watching it darken as it touched the grounds. This small shift changed everything. What had once been a mindless necessity became a meditation on transformation: water becoming coffee, darkness becoming day, sleep becoming wakefulness. The ritual created a buffer between the vulnerability of first waking and the demands of the day ahead. It gave me something to do with my hands while my mind found its footing. From this first ritual, others grew naturally. While the coffee brewed, I began to step outside, regardless of weather. Some mornings this meant wrapping myself in a coat and boots. Others required only the soft clothes I had slept in. The important thing was not comfort, but presence, allowing myself to feel the morning air, to notice the quality of light, to remember that I existed in a physical world beyond the confines of my worried thoughts. The outdoor ritual taught me about the healing power of temperature and texture. Cool morning air against sleep-warm skin created a gentle shock that brought me fully into my body. Rough concrete beneath bare feet grounded me literally and figuratively. the scent of dew, or the sound of early birds reminded me that life was happening all around me, regardless of my internal weather. These simple acts, making coffee with intention, stepping into the morning air, became the foundation upon which a more elaborate but still beautifully simple practice grew. I began to notice how different types of mornings called for different responses. Cloudy mornings invited contemplation and reflection. Clear mornings called for gratitude and appreciation. Rainy mornings offered the gift of sound, the gentle percussion of drops on leaves, the whispered conversations between water and earth. One of the most powerful discoveries was the ritual of writing before the day began. This wasn't journaling in the conventional sense, with analysis and goal setting and problem solving. Instead, it was a practice of allowing whatever wanted to emerge onto paper without judgment or agenda. Sometimes this meant capturing dreams before they faded. Other times it involved writing down worries to clear them from my mind. Often, it was simply describing what I noticed: the color of the sky, the sound of wind in trees, the feeling of being awake while the world still slept. This morning writing practice became a form of meditation, a way of emptying the mind's overnight accumulation of thoughts and concerns. It was as if sleep had stirred up sediment in the clear water of consciousness, and writing allowed the particles to settle, leaving clarity behind. The act of moving pen across paper, I quickly learned that handwriting worked better than typing. For this purpose created a rhythm that was both soothing and grounding. The ritual of morning writing taught me to observe my thoughts without immediately acting on them. When worry appeared on the page, I could see it for what it was: just worry, not truth, not prediction, not command. When gratitude emerged, I could acknowledge it without the pressure to do anything with it. The page became a safe space for whatever my mind wanted to release before engaging with the day. Another ritual that emerged was the practice of mindful breathing, though I resist calling it formal meditation because that might suggest it requires training or expertise. It was simply the act of paying attention to breath, not changing it, not controlling it, just noticing the automatic miracle of air moving in and out of my body. Sometimes I would count breaths. Sometimes I would simply observe the pause between inhale and exhale, the natural stillness that exists at the center of breathing. This attention to breath became an anchor I could return to throughout the day. When stress arose, when decisions felt overwhelming, when the pace of life accelerated beyond comfort, I could remember the morning's lesson of breath, that life continues regardless of my management, that the most essential functions happen without my conscious control, that there is always a pause available between stimulus and response. The beauty of these rituals lay not in their complexity, but in their simplicity, not in their novelty, but in their repetition. Day after day, the same basic actions: making coffee, stepping outside, writing, breathing, created a framework within which variability could safely exist. No two mornings were identical, but the underlying structure remained constant, providing stability in an uncertain world. This consistency became especially important during difficult periods. When life brought challenges, illness, loss, disappointment, change, the morning rituals remained available. They didn't solve problems or eliminate pain, but they provided a reliable refuge, a daily reminder that peace was possible even in the midst of turmoil. The rituals became proof that some things endure, that beauty persists, that I could find my way back to center regardless of what storms might be raging. Over time, I noticed that these morning practices began to influence the rest of my day. The patience I cultivated while waiting for coffee to brew showed up in other situations requiring patience. The attention I paid to morning light made me more aware of afternoon shadows and evening colors. The stillness I found in early hours became something I could access even in crowded, noisy environments. The rituals also taught me about the relationship between solitude and connection. By spending time alone each morning, not in loneliness, but in communion with the larger world, I found myself more present and available in my relationships with others. The cup I filled in morning stillness didn't empty throughout the day. Instead, it seemed to refill itself, providing more to offer in conversations, collaborations, and moments of shared experience. Perhaps most importantly, the morning rituals revealed the profound difference between doing and being. So much of daily life involves doing, working, cleaning, organizing, communicating, solving, managing. But the morning rituals were primarily about being present, being aware, being open to whatever the moment offered. This wasn't laziness or avoidance, it was practice for a different way of existing in the world. The practice of being doesn't end when the morning rituals conclude. Instead, the morning becomes a training ground for carrying that quality of presence into more challenging situations. The stillness cultivated in silence can be accessed even in noise. The peace found in solitude can be maintained even in crowds. The clarity discovered in morning light can illuminate the complexities of afternoon shadows. Creating morning rituals doesn't require following someone else's prescription or adopting practices that feel foreign or forced. The most sustainable rituals are those that emerge from paying attention to what brings you back to yourself, what creates space for peace to enter, what helps you remember who you are beneath all the roles you play and responsibilities you carry. The invitation is simple. Create space in your morning for something other than urgency. Whether it's 5 minutes or 50, whether it involves coffee or tea or just water, whether it happens indoors or outside or somewhere in between, the specific details matter far less than the intention to begin each day with presence rather than pressure, with awareness rather than automation. These rituals become love letters to yourself. Daily reminders that you deserve moments of peace, that beauty is worth witnessing, that stillness is not empty time, but full-time time, filled with the essential nourishment that allows everything else to flow more gracefully. Chapter 3. The Geography of Solitude. Every space holds the potential for solitude, but some places seem naturally designed for writers if the very air there knows how to hold silence, how to cradle contemplation. These are the geographies of solitude, landscapes both external and internal where we can retreat, not in isolation but in connection to something larger than our daily concerns. My first conscious discovery of such a place happened by accident, the way many important discoveries do. I had been staying in a small cabin nestled against the foothills of mountains I had never seen before, rented for what was supposed to be a working retreat but became something far more essential. Each morning, I would step onto the cabin's small porch with my coffee, intending to review notes for the day's writing, but finding myself instead drawn into the particular quality of stillness that surrounded this place. The morning mist would rise from a small meadow that stretched between the cabin and the tree line, creating a landscape that seemed to exist halfway between earth and dream. The silence there was not empty, but fulfilled with the barely audible conversations of leaves, the distant murmur of a stream I could not see but could sense somewhere beyond the trees, the soft percussion of dew dropping from branch to grass. In this geography of solitude, I discovered something crucial. External landscapes have the power to awaken internal ones. The open meadows seemed to create openness within my chest. The patient stillness of the mountains taught my racing mind about different rhythms of being. The mist rising from earth toward sky showed me how thoughts, too, could lift and dissipate rather than clinging with desperate intensity to the ground of immediate concern. But geography's gift to solitude is not limited to dramatic landscapes or remote locations. Every environment offers its own version of sacred space, its own invitation to step aside from the momentum of daily life and into a different quality of presence. The key is learning to see these opportunities, to recognize the potential for solitude that exists even in familiar places. My apartment balcony, overlooking a busy street in an urban neighborhood, became one of my most treasured geographies of solitude. From street level, this balcony was unremarkable. Small concrete platform with a railing, furnished with 2 simple chairs and a small table that collected mail and coffee cups in equal measure. But viewed from the perspective of morning practice, it transformed into something sacred. The balcony offered, what I came to think of as productive distance. I was close enough to the street to feel connected to the human world, to wave at the mail carrier making his rounds, to watch neighbors, walking dogs, or hurrying to catch buses, but elevated enough to feel removed from the urgency of that world. From this vantage point, I could observe the daily choreography of the neighborhood without being pulled into its rhythm. This productive distance became a metaphor for the kind of perspective that solitude offers. It doesn't separate us from life, but allows us to see life more clearly, to understand our place within the larger patterns without being overwhelmed by the immediate demands of participation. From the balcony, I could witness the morning's gradual animation lights appearing in windows, cars emerging from garages, the street slowly waking up without needing to immediately join the dance. The balcony taught me that solitude is not about isolation, but about choosing how we engage with the world around us. Even in the midst of urban density, even with traffic sounds and neighbor noise and all the evidence of human activity, it was possible to find pockets of peace, moments of stillness that existed, not despite the activity, but somehow within it. Different types of morning weather created different geographies of solitude on this same small balcony. Foggy mornings wrapped the space in privacy, creating an intimate room with walls of mist that made the familiar street seem mysterious and distant. Rain transformed the balcony into a covered observation deck where I could witness the street's transformation underwater. The way pavement darkened and gleamed, the way people moved differently under umbrellas, the way rain connected earth and sky in visible threads. Snow mornings were perhaps the most magical, turning the balcony into a threshold between the warm, lit interior of the apartment and a world made soft and quiet by fallen precipitation. The street sounds were muffled, footsteps became whispers, and the ordinary neighborhood wore a costume of extraordinary beauty. These snowy morning sessions taught me about the way external transformation can create internal shift. How a change in the landscape can change the quality of thought, the rhythm of breath, the openness of heart. But I also discovered geographies of solitude that existed entirely indoors, spaces that could be transformed through attention and intention rather than location. A corner of my bedroom, furnished with nothing more than a single comfortable chair positioned near a window, became as powerful a retreat as any mountain cabin. The key was not the corner itself, but the commitment to use it for nothing but morning stillness, no phone calls, no reading of news, no planning of days. Just sitting, breathing, watching light change as morning progressed. This indoor geography taught me about the power of designation, the way we can create sacred space through purpose, rather than relying on naturally sacred places. The chair by the window was no different from any other chair when used for ordinary activities, but when used consistently for morning practice, it accumulated a kind of energy, a quality of peace that made sitting in it feel like stepping into a different mode of being. The window itself became a crucial element of indoor solitude geography. Windows are thresholds, boundaries that separate while simultaneously connecting. From my morning chair, I could be fully inside warm, comfortable, private while staying visually connected to the outside world. The window framed the sky like a painting that changed continuously throughout the morning, offering an ever-shifting focal point for attention. I began to notice how different windows created different qualities of solitude. East-facing windows offered the drama of sunrise, the daily miracle of light's return, the gradual warming that comes with morning's progression. South-facing windows provided steadier light but more subtle changes, the kind of gentle illumination that makes thoughts feel clearer and more settled. West-facing windows offered the gift of reflected light, not the direct drama of sunrise, but the softer beauty of light, bouncing off other buildings, filtered through trees, painted across walls. Even windowless spaces could become geographies of solitude when approached with the right intention. A bathroom with the door closed, the rest of the household still sleeping, could become a sanctuary for a few minutes of private morning practice. The key was recognizing these spaces as potential rather than limitation, seeing solitude as something that could be cultivated rather than something that required perfect conditions. The most important discovery about the geography of solitude was that it exists as much in time as in space. Certain hours seem naturally designed for contemplation, regardless of location. The hour before dawn, when the world hovers between sleep and waking, creates its own geographia, temporal landscape that exists everywhere and nowhere, available to anyone willing to rise early enough to enter it. This temporal geography of early morning has its own topography. There is the deep valley of pre-dawn darkness, when the world feels most intimate and protected. There is the gradual slope of dawn's approach, when anticipation builds and light begins its slow reveal. There is the peak moment of sunrise itself, followed by the gentle descent into established morning, when the world becomes itself again but somehow transformed by having been witnessed in its becoming. Learning to recognize and inhabit these geographies of solitude, whether carved from landscape or carved from time, whether found in remote places or created in familiar corners, becomes a practice of resourcefulness and creativity. It's the practice of understanding that peace is not dependent on perfect circumstances, but can be cultivated wherever we find ourselves, whenever we choose to slow down enough to notice what's actually present. The external geography begins to create internal geography. The meadow's openness appears within the chest. The mountain's patience settles into the nervous system. The window's threshold quality becomes a way of being present to life while maintaining enough detachment to see clearly. We begin to carry these landscapes within us, accessible even when we're far from the physical places where we first discovered them. This portability of solitude geography becomes one of morning practice's greatest gifts. Once we've learned to find stillness in various external settings, we can begin to access that stillness even in challenging environments. The peace discovered on a quiet balcony can be remembered in a crowded subway. The spaciousness felt in an empty meadow can be accessed in a busy office. The clarity found by a dawn window can illuminate afternoon complexities. The geography of solitude is ultimately about learning to be at home in ourselves, regardless of where we find ourselves in the world. It's about discovering that every place holds the potential for peace, every moment offers the possibility of presence, every space can become sacred when approached with attention and reverence. Morning practice teaches us to be explorers of these possibilities, cartographers of our own capacity for stillness, architects of environments that support our return to center. Chapter 4. Memory's Gentle Current. Memory moves through morning consciousness like water, through landscape, sometimes rushing with the intensity of a spring flood, sometimes barely trickling through the dry channels of a mind focused elsewhere, but always present, always shaping the contours of our inner terrain. In the quiet hours before dawn, when the usual barriers between past and present grow thin, memory offers both gift and challenge to those seeking peace in morning stillness. There is something about the quality of early morning light that seems to illuminate not just the external world, but the internal archives of experience. Perhaps it's the similarity between dawn's gentle emergence and the way memories surface from the unconscious depths of sleep. Or perhaps it's simply that, in the absence of immediate demands and distractions, the mind naturally returns to its vast collection of moments, scenes, and sensations gathered across the years. I first became aware of memory as an active partner in morning practice during a period when I was grieving the loss of my grandmother. She had been gone for several months, but in the pre-dawn hours, she seemed to return with startling vividness, not as vision or supernatural presence, but as memory so complete it felt like reunion. I would sit with my coffee in the early darkness, and suddenly I would be 8 years old again, standing in her kitchen while she made biscuits, flour dusting her hands, and the morning light streaming through her curtains in exactly the same golden slant I was watching through my own window decades later. These memory visitations initially disturbed my attempts at morning peace. I had been seeking emptiness, stillness, a break from the complexity of thinking and feeling. Instead, I found myself flooded with the past, not just memories of my grandmother, but whole cascades of remembrance that seemed triggered by the slightest similarity between past and present. The smell of coffee would resurrect mornings from childhood. The sound of birds would summon summer vacations from 20 years ago. The feel of cool air through an open window would transport me to mornings in places I had almost forgotten visiting. My first instinct was to resist these intrusions, to try to push memory away and return to the peaceful emptiness I imagined morning meditation should provide. But memory, I discovered, is not easily dismissed. The harder I pushed against it, the more insistent it became, like water pressing against a dam until it finds every crack and crevice through which to flow. The breakthrough came when I stopped fighting memory's presence and began to explore its offerings with curiosity rather than resistance. What if these memories weren't interruptions to morning peace, but invitations into a different kind of understanding? What if the past's appearance in present moments was not distraction, but connection, a reminder of the continuity that runs beneath the surface changes of life? One morning, instead of trying to push away a particularly vivid memory of my father teaching me to skip stones at a lake we had visited during my childhood, I allowed myself to fully enter the remembrance. I could feel the smooth weight of the flat stones in my small hand, could smell the pine-scented air of that long-ago morning, could hear my father's patient voice explaining the physics of angle and velocity in terms simple enough for a child to understand. But more than sensory detail, what emerged in allowing this memory was a recognition of patterns that spanned decades. The patience my father had shown that morning by the lake was the same patience I was now learning to offer myself in morning practice. The wonder I had felt watching stones dance across water's surface was the same wonder I experienced watching light dance across morning sky. The sense of possibility that had filled that childhood morning, the feeling that the world was vast and full of things to discover, was available to me still, right here in my adult kitchen, if I remained open to it. This realization transformed my relationship with memory in morning practice. Instead of seeing it as interruption, I began to recognize it as teacher. Memory, I understood, was not just passive storage of the past, but active connection between who I had been and who I was becoming. The memories that surfaced during morning stillness were not random, but somehow selected by unconscious wisdom, chosen because they had something to offer the present moment. Some mornings, memory offered comfort. I would remember my mother's voice reading bedtime stories, and that remembered safety would soothe anxieties about the day ahead. I would recall moments of past success and satisfaction, and those memories would provide encouragement for current challenges. I would remember times when difficulties had resolved, when problems had found solutions, when pain had eventually transformed into wisdom, and these memories would offer perspective on present struggles. Other mornings, memory offered instruction. I would remember mistakes I had made and recognize patterns I was still repeating. I would recall moments when I had acted from fear rather than love, and understand how those same fears were still shaping current choices. I would remember times when I had been truly present and happy, and these memories would illuminate what was missing from my current experience. Perhaps most surprisingly, memory often offered forgiveness. In the gentle light of morning reflection, past hurts seemed softer, past mistakes seemed more understandable, past judgments seemed less absolute. I would remember arguments with friends and suddenly see the other person's perspective with clarity that had been impossible at the time. I would recall my own moments of failure or weakness and feel compassion for the person I had been, struggling with challenges I hadn't yet learned to meet with grace. This forgiveness worked in both directions. Morning memory sessions became opportunities to release resentments I hadn't even realized I was carrying, small grudges against people who had disappointed me, lingering anger at circumstances that hadn't unfolded as I had hoped, frustration with myself for not being who I thought I should be by now. In the spaciousness of morning stillness, these held emotions could finally find room to breathe, to shift, to transform from tight knots of pain into something more fluid and forgiving. I also discovered that memory has its own seasons and cycles. There were periods when morning remembrance focused primarily on childhood, as if some part of me needed to reconnect with early wonder and possibility. There were seasons when memories of specific people dominated, friends I had lost touch with, family members who had died, teachers who had shaped my thinking. There were times when professional memories surfaced most frequently, moments of past work satisfaction or disappointment that seemed relevant to current career questions. Learning to work with these cycles rather than against them became part of morning practice's deeper lessons. When childhood memories persisted, I learned to ask what qualities from that earlier time might be needed now. When memories of specific people dominated, I learned to consider what those relationships had taught me and how those lessons might apply to current relationships. When work memories surfaced, I learned to explore what they revealed about my evolving understanding of purpose and contribution. The practice of writing during morning hours proved particularly helpful for working with memory. When a strong remembrance emerged, I would put pen to paper and let the memory unfold through writing, not analyzing it or trying to draw immediate conclusions, but simply allowing it to express itself completely. Often, this process revealed details I hadn't noticed when the memory first appeared, connections I hadn't recognized, emotions I hadn't fully processed. This morning, writing about memory became a form of dialogue between past and present selves. I would write about childhood experiences from my adult perspective, understanding them with compassion and insight that hadn't been available to me as a child. I would write about past relationships from my current understanding of love and friendship, seeing patterns and possibilities that had been invisible at the time. I would write about former dreams and disappointments from my present knowledge of how life actually unfolds, recognizing both the necessary losses and unexpected gifts that had emerged from apparent failures. Through this practice, I began to understand memory not as fixed record, but as living relationship. The past wasn't simply what had happened to me, it was what I continued to make of what had happened to me. Each morning's encounter with memory was an opportunity to revise that relationship, to find new meaning in old experiences, to heal wounds that were still tender, to integrate lessons that hadn't been fully absorbed. Memory also became a bridge between solitude and connection. In remembering shared experiences, I felt connected to people who were geographically distant or even no longer living. In remembering moments of profound solitude from the past, I felt less alone in present solitude. Memory revealed the continuity between seemingly separate experiences, the threads that wove individual moments into larger patterns of meaning. Perhaps most importantly, morning encounters with memory taught me about the non-linear nature of healing and growth. Progress, I learned, wasn't simply forward motion, but included circling back to revisit experiences with new understanding. The same childhood memory that had once carried only pain could later reveal unexpected gifts. The same past relationship that had once seemed purely disappointing could later be appreciated for its contribution to current wisdom. This understanding brought tremendous relief to the perfectionist part of me that wanted healing to be linear, growth to be steady, and the past to stay neatly in the past. Memory's gentle current in morning practice taught me that consciousness moves more like a river than a highway, sometimes flowing swiftly forward, sometimes eddying back to revisit familiar shores, sometimes pooling in quiet depths where reflection becomes possible. The gift of memory in morning practice is not nostalgia or escapism, but integration. Each remembered moment that surfaces in the stillness of early hours offers an opportunity to weave the past more fully into the present, to understand the continuity of our becoming, to recognize that we are not just who we are today, but the accumulation of all we have been and all we have learned from being. In this way, memory becomes not an interruption to morning peace, but one of its deepest sources. The stillness doesn't empty us of the past, but allows us to hold it with greater spaciousness, to let its gifts flow freely while releasing its burdens. Morning practice teaches us that true peace comes not from forgetting, but from remembering with love, remembering ourselves, our experiences, our connections with such tenderness that even painful memories can become sources of wisdom and compassion. Chapter 5. The Practice of Being. In a world that worships doing, being can feel like rebellion. It requires courage to sit still when everything around us suggests that movement equals progress, that productivity equals worth, that busy equals important. Yet, In the quiet hours of morning practice, we discover that being is not passive but profoundly active. It is the foundation from which all meaningful action emerges. The practice of being begins with the radical act of stopping. Not stopping because we're exhausted or forced to pause, but stopping by choice, stopping as a conscious decision to step outside the momentum of constant motion. This stopping is not easy for minds accustomed to perpetual activity. The first moments of intentional stillness often feel uncomfortable, like sitting in a chair that doesn't quite fit or wearing clothes that are somehow the wrong size. I remember my early attempts at morning stillness feeling almost physically painful. My body would fidget, my mind would race with lists of things I should be doing instead, and every sound from the world outside would feel like an accusation. Look, everyone else is already busy while you sit here doing nothing. It took time to understand that this discomfort was not a sign that I was doing something wrong, but evidence of how thoroughly I had been conditioned to equate my value with my activity. The breakthrough came gradually, through learning to distinguish between the voice of wisdom and the voice of conditioning. The voice of conditioning spoke in shoulds and shouldn'ts, in comparisons and judgments, in urgent reminders of all the ways I was falling short of some imagined standard of productivity. The voice of wisdom spoke more quietly, in sensations rather than words, in the gradual relaxation of muscles I hadn't realized were tense, in the deepening of breath I hadn't noticed was shallow. Learning to trust the voice of wisdom over the voice of conditioning became one of morning practice's most valuable lessons. Wisdom suggested that rest was not laziness but necessity, that reflection was not indulgence but intelligence, that being present to the moment was not avoiding responsibility, but preparing to meet responsibility from a place of clarity rather than reactivity. The practice of being, I discovered, has many layers. The most surface layer involves simply sitting, still not doing anything with the hands, not going anywhere with the feet, not speaking with the mouth. This physical stillness, while seemingly simple, proves challenging for bodies accustomed to constant motion. But as this surface stillness settles, deeper layers become accessible. Mental stillness is the next layer, not thinking about nothing, which is impossible, but thinking about what's actually present rather than what's absent, anticipated, or remembered. This mental stillness doesn't require emptying the mind but changing the quality of attention. Instead of thoughts pulling attention into imaginary futures or recalled pasts, attention rests in what's actually happening. The sensation of breathing, the quality of light, the sounds of the morning world awakening. This present moment awareness reveals how rarely we actually inhabit the time and place where our bodies are located. Most of our mental energy, I realized, was spent in conversations with people who weren't present, solving problems that hadn't yet occurred, or rehearsing scenarios that might never unfold. The practice of being offered a different way of using consciousness, not as a tool for planning and analyzing, but as a capacity for experiencing what was actually available to be experienced. Emotional stillness forms another layer of being practice. This doesn't mean feeling nothing or forcing positive emotions, but allowing whatever feelings are present to exist without immediately needing to change them, analyze them, or act upon them. Morning practice became a laboratory for observing the weather patterns of emotion, how feelings arise and pass away, how they intensify and diminish, how they color perception without necessarily reflecting truth. I learned to greet emotions during morning stillness the way I might greet weather, acknowledging their presence without taking them personally. Anxiety might arrive like morning fog, obscuring clarity but not eliminating it. Sadness might settle like gentle rain, bringing its own form of nourishment despite its temporary dampening of mood. Joy might break through like sunrise, illuminating everything with golden possibility. This emotional acceptance during morning practice created ripple effects throughout the day. When challenging emotions arose in other contexts, I could remember the morning lesson that feelings are temporary weather patterns rather than permanent features of the landscape. This didn't make difficult emotions pleasant, but it made them workable, less overwhelming, because they were held within a larger understanding of their transient nature. The deepest layer of being practice involves what I can only call spiritual stillness, a quality of presence that transcends thinking, feeling, and even the sense of being a separate, self-managing experience. In these moments, which come unpredictably and can't be forced, there's a recognition of being part of something larger than individual identity. The boundary between self and world becomes permeable, and consciousness feels less like something I possess and more like something I participate in. These experiences of spiritual stillness can't be summoned or scheduled, but morning practice creates conditions where they're more likely to occur. The combination of physical stillness, mental presence, and emotional acceptance seems to create an opening, a receptivity to dimensions of experience that are usually overshadowed by the noise of daily life. What surprised me most about these deeper experiences was their ordinariness. They didn't involve dramatic visions or mystical phenomena, but rather a profound settling into what was already present. It was as if the usual sense of effort and separation simply relaxed, revealing an underlying peace that had been there all along, waiting to be noticed. The practice of being also taught me about different qualities of attention. There's focused attention, which concentrates on specific objects like breath or sensations. There's open attention, which remains aware of whatever arises without fixating on any particular element. There's spacious attention, which seems to expand beyond the boundaries of individual awareness into something more collective or universal. Each quality of attention offers its own gifts and serves different purposes. Focused attention helps train the mind to stay present rather than wandering into distraction. Open attention develops flexibility and acceptance, allowing experience to unfold without forcing it into preconceived patterns. Spacious attention offers glimpses of connection and unity that can transform perspective on both personal challenges and global concerns. Learning to move fluidly between these different qualities of attention became part of morning practice's sophistication. Some mornings called for focused attention when the mind was particularly scattered or when specific clarity was needed for the day ahead. Other mornings invited open attention when there was no particular agenda and the moment seemed to offer its own guidance. Spacious attention often emerged naturally during periods of deep stillness, when the boundaries of individual awareness seemed to soften and expand. The practice of being also revealed the relationship between inner and outer stillness. External quiet, the relative silence of early morning hour, certainly supported inner peace, but I learned that inner stillness could be maintained even in noisier environments. The peace cultivated in morning silence became portable, accessible, even in the midst of afternoon chaos. This portability of inner stillness became one of morning practice's most practical gifts. When faced with stressful situations throughout the day, I could return to the quality of presence cultivated in morning practice. This didn't eliminate stress, but changed my relationship to it. Instead of being overwhelmed by challenging circumstances, I could remain present within them, responding from stillness rather than reacting from agitation. The practice of being also taught me about the difference between effort and intention. Effort implies pushing, striving, trying to make something happen through force of will. Intention involves clarity about direction without attachment to specific outcomes, allowing for receptivity and responsiveness rather than control. Morning practice required intention, the intention to show up, to be present, to remain open, but worked best when effort was minimal. This distinction between effort and intention became applicable to other areas of life. In work, relationships, and creative pursuits, I learned to approach challenges with clear intention, but without the exhausting effort of trying to control outcomes. This shift didn't reduce effectiveness, but increased it when action emerged from stillness rather than agitation. It tended to be more skillful, more appropriate to actual circumstances rather than imagined fears. Perhaps most importantly, the practice of being taught me that presence is not a destination but a way of traveling. It's not something to achieve and then possess, but something to return to again and again, moment by moment, breath by breath. Each morning's practice was not about becoming someone who had mastered stillness, but about remembering how to access stillness that was already available. This understanding removed the pressure to get morning practice right or to have consistent experiences. Some mornings offered profound peace and clarity. Other mornings were filled with distraction and restlessness. Both types of mornings were practice opportunities to remember that being is not dependent on particular states of mind, but is the awareness within which all states of mind arise and pass away. The practice of being, cultivated in morning stillness, becomes a foundation for living with greater presence and less reactivity. It doesn't solve all problems or eliminate all difficulties, but it provides an anchor point, a place of refuge that remains accessible regardless of external circumstances. In a world that often feels chaotic and overwhelming, this inner stillness becomes not a luxury, but a necessity, a way of maintaining sanity and compassion in the midst of constant change. Chapter 6. Cultivating Inner Weather. Just as external weather patterns move across the landscape of sky and earth, internal weather patterns move across the landscape of consciousness. Learning to observe, understand, and work skillfully with these inner conditions becomes one of morning practice's most valuable teachings. In the stillness of early hours, when the usual distractions and demands are absent, we can develop meteorological awareness of our own inner climate. The metaphor of inner weather first occurred to me during a particularly turbulent period of life when my emotional state seemed as unpredictable and powerful as actual storms. One morning, sitting with my coffee as rain drummed against the windows, I noticed an almost perfect correspondence between the external weather and my internal state. The gray clouds outside seemed to match the heavy feeling in my chest. The steady rhythm of raindrops echoed the persistent drumbeat of anxious thoughts. Rather than seeing this correspondence as mere coincidence, I began to explore it as invitation. What if I could learn to observe my internal weather with the same detached interest I brought to external weather? What if I could develop the same acceptance for difficult emotional states that I had for rainy days, acknowledging them as temporary conditions that would inevitably pass, rather than permanent features of the landscape? This shift in perspective proved transformational. Instead of fighting against difficult emotions or judging myself for having them, I began to study them with curiosity. Anxiety, I discovered, moved through consciousness like a storm, front-building slowly, reaching intensity, then gradually dissipating. Sadness flowed more like a steady rain, sometimes gentle and nourishing, sometimes heavy and overwhelming, but always eventually clearing. Joy burst forth like sudden sunshine, illuminating everything with golden possibility, but also like actual sunshine, not meant to be grasped or held permanently. Morning practice became a daily weather station where I could observe these patterns without being swept away by them. In the stillness of early hours, I could notice the barometric pressure of mood, the wind patterns of thought, the precipitation of emotion that colored the day's beginning. This observational stance didn't eliminate difficult weather patterns, but changed my relationship to them fundamentally. One of the most important discoveries was learning to distinguish between weather and climate. Weather represents the temporary conditions, the passing storms of anger, the fog of confusion, the unexpected sunshine of delight. Climate represents the deeper, more stable patterns, the general tendency toward optimism or pessimism, the underlying capacity for resilience or fragility, the baseline level of contentment or discontent. Understanding this distinction helped me stop treating temporary weather as if it defined my permanent climate. A morning of anxiety didn't mean I was an anxious person. A day of sadness didn't indicate a sad life. A period of anger didn't define my character. These were weather patterns moving through, not fundamental characteristics of who I was. The practice of inner weather observation taught me about the value of not immediately acting on emotional states. In the same way that we don't plan outdoor activities based solely on current weather, knowing that conditions will change throughout the day, I learned to avoid making important decisions based solely on current emotional weather. Morning practice created space between feeling and action, allowing for the wisdom that emerges when emotions are acknowledged but not automatically obeyed. This space between feeling and action became one of morning practice's most practical gifts. When anger arose during the day, I could remember the morning lesson that anger, like a thunderstorm, contains tremendous energy but doesn't last forever. When sadness appeared, I could recall that sadness, like rain, can be nourishing even when it's uncomfortable. When anxiety manifested, I could recognize it as fog temporarily obscuring clarity, but not eliminating the landscape underneath. Different types of inner weather called for different responses, just as external weather calls for different clothing and activities. High-pressure emotional states anxiety, excitement, urgency benefited from grounding practices, slower breathing, attention to physical sensations, connection with stable elements like earth or trees. Low-pressure staticidness, lethargy, disconnection often needed gentle activation, movement, light, connection with others or with inspiring ideas. Morning practice became an opportunity to check the inner weather forecast and prepare accordingly. If the morning revealed stormy emotional conditions, I could plan for extra self-care throughout the day. If the morning showed clear inner skies, I could take advantage of the good conditions to tackle challenging projects or have difficult conversations. If the morning felt foggy and unclear, I could adjust expectations and focus on simple, grounding activities until clarity returned. I also learned about the seasonal patterns of inner weather. There were times of year when my emotional climate naturally shifted, periods of high energy and outward focus, alternating with times of introspection and rest. Learning to recognize and honor these natural rhythms, rather than fighting against them, brought tremendous relief. Instead of judging myself for being less social during introspective seasons or less productive during rest periods, I could work with these natural cycles. The connection between external and internal weather proved both real and useful. Cloudy days often did correspond with more contemplative moods, while sunny days frequently brought increased energy and optimism. But I also discovered that this correspondence wasn't absolute. Internal weather had its own patterns and could be influenced by factors beyond external conditions. Morning practice became a laboratory for experimenting with internal weather modification. While I couldn't control which emotions arose, I could influence how they developed and how long they lasted. Gentle breathing practices could help dissipate anxiety storms more quickly. Gratitude practices could help clear the fog of negativity. Physical movement could help shift stagnant emotional energy. But perhaps the most important lesson was learning when not to try to change internal weather at all. Some emotional storms needed to be fully experienced rather than quickly cleared. Some periods of sadness contain important information that could only be received by staying present with the feeling rather than rushing to happiness. Some times of confusion were actually periods of necessary reorganization that required patience rather than forced clarity. This wisdom of knowing when to work with emotional weather and when to simply weather it became increasingly sophisticated over time. Morning practice provided the regular opportunity to develop this discernment, the ability to sense whether a particular emotional state wanted to be shifted or simply witnessed, whether it contained a message that needed to be heard or was just temporary atmospheric disturbance. The cultivation of inner weather awareness also revealed the interconnectedness between individual and collective emotional climates. During periods of social stress or global uncertainty, my personal inner weather was inevitably influenced by the broader emotional atmosphere. Recognizing this influence helped me understand which emotional states were purely personal and which were shared responses to collective conditions. This understanding brought both challenge and relief. The challenge was accepting that individual emotional weather couldn't be completely separated from collective conditions, that personal peace wasn't possible in complete isolation from the world's storms. The relief was recognizing that difficult emotional states weren't always personal failures, but sometimes appropriate responses to challenging circumstances. Morning practice became a way of tending to both personal and collective inner weather. By cultivating stability and clarity in my own emotional climate, I could contribute to the collective emotional atmosphere rather than simply being tossed about by it. By developing skill in working with difficult emotions, I could remain present and helpful during collective storms rather than being overwhelmed by them. The practice also taught me about the beauty that can be found in all types of inner weather. Stormy emotions, while uncomfortable, brought intensity and power that could fuel creativity and necessary changes. Foggy states, while confusing, created mystery and possibility that clear states sometimes lacked. Even difficult weather patterns carried their own gifts when approached with acceptance rather than resistance. This appreciation for the full range of inner weather helped me develop what I came to think of as emotional resilience, the ability to avoid difficult emotions, but the capacity to remain present and functional during emotional storms. Like a well-built house that can withstand various weather conditions, morning practice helped me develop an inner structure that could accommodate the full range of human feeling without being damaged by it. The cultivation of inner weather awareness ultimately taught me that emotions, like external weather, are natural phenomena that follow patterns and laws. They arise from conditions, develop according to their nature, and eventually pass away to be replaced by other patterns. Understanding this natural flow brought tremendous freedom. The freedom to feel fully, without being controlled by feelings, to experience the full range of human emotion without losing stability or peace. Morning practice became a daily meteorological training that prepared me for whatever inner weather the day might bring. By starting each day with conscious awareness of internal conditions, I could meet the day's challenges with greater skill and less reactivity. The stillness of morning hours provided the perfect conditions for developing this inner weather wisdom, the foundation for living with greater emotional intelligence and resilience. Chapter 7. The Architecture of Peace. Peace, I have learned, is not something that happens to us, but something we build deliberately, carefully, with the same attention an architect brings to designing a structure that must withstand both daily use and occasional storms. Morning practice provides both the blueprints and the daily construction work for this most essential building project, creating a life that can hold peace even in the midst of chaos. The metaphor of architecture first struck me during a morning when I was sitting in my usual chair, watching light gradually fill the room, and I realized that this simple routine had become something much more significant than I had initially recognized. The physical space, the time boundaries, the repeated actions, the quality of attentional of these elements were working together to create something that hadn't existed before, a reliable sanctuary that I could enter each day, regardless of what storms might be raging in the outside world. Like any good architecture, the structure of morning practice needed to be both sturdy and flexible. Sturdy enough to provide reliable support when everything else felt uncertain, but flexible enough to accommodate the natural variations in energy, mood, and circumstance that characterize human life. The foundation had to be simple enough to maintain consistently, but rich enough to support continued growth and discovery. The foundation stones of this architecture, I discovered, were surprisingly basic. Time was the first stone knot, large amounts of time, but protected time, time that was claimed before other demands could compete for it. Even 15 minutes, when truly protected from intrusion, proved sufficient to begin building something substantial. The key was consistency, rather than duration showing up at the same time each day, creating a rhythm that the nervous system could recognize and prepare for. Space was the second foundation stone. This didn't require a dedicated room or elaborate setup, but it did require some physical area that could be associated with practice: a corner of a bedroom, a spot by a window, even a particular chair that was used for nothing else during those early hours. The space became charged with intention over time, holding the energy of repeated practice in the same way that libraries hold the energy of reading or studios hold the energy of creation. Routine formed the third foundation stone knot, rigid routine that felt like prison, but flexible routine that felt like coming home. The basic elements might include making coffee or tea, sitting in the designated space, perhaps writing or breathing, or simply watching the morning unfold. These activities became ritual not through complexity but through repetition, creating a sequence that signaled to both mind and body that this was time for something different from the usual rush of daily life. Attention was the fourth and perhaps most crucial foundation stone. This involved learning to shift from the scattered attention that characterizes so much of modern life to a more gathered, focused quality of awareness. Not concentrated attention that excludes everything else, but collected attention that can hold whatever arises without being pulled into reactive engagement. This quality of attention had to be developed gradually, like physical strength, through regular practice. Upon these foundation stones, more elaborate structures could be built. The walls of this peaceful architecture were constructed from boundaries learning to say no to early morning intrusions, resisting the urge to immediately check phones or news, protecting the practice space from the encroachment of work, thoughts, or family demands. These boundaries weren't walls of separation, but walls of definition, clearly marking what belonged to this time and what belonged to other times. The roof of this structure was composed of acceptance of whatever arose during practice without needing to fix it, change it, or understand it completely. Some mornings brought clarity and peace. Other mornings brought agitation and distraction. Both types of mornings were held equally under this roof of acceptance, protected from the harsh judgment that might otherwise make practice feel like another task to be performed perfectly. Windows in this architecture provided connection between inner and outer worlds. Morning practice wasn't about escaping life, but about finding a vantage point from which life could be seen more clearly. The practice space needed to remain connected to the larger world through actual windows that showed changing light and weather, through awareness of sounds from the awakening neighborhood, through the constant reminder that this inner work was ultimately in service of more skillful engagement with outer responsibilities. The doors of this peaceful architecture swung both ways, providing entrance into the sanctuary of practice and exit back into the world of action. Learning to move gracefully between these two modes became its own practice. How to transition from the spaciousness of morning stillness into the focused attention required for work. How to carry the peace discovered in solitude into the complexity of relationships. How to maintain the clarity found in silence, even when surrounded by noise and demand. This transition practice proved as important as the morning practice itself. The peace cultivated in early hours needed to be portable, accessible throughout the day rather than locked away in a morning compartment. This required developing what I came to think of as architectural memory, the ability to remember and recreate the essential qualities of morning peace, even in very different circumstances. The plumbing of this peaceful architecture involved learning to work skillfully with the flow of emotions and thoughts. Like water in a well-designed building, feelings needed to be able to flow freely without causing damage to the overall structure. This meant creating internal drainage systems for difficult emotions, ways of acknowledging and expressing challenging feelings without being overwhelmed by them. It also meant ensuring adequate circulation of positive emotions, not forcing joy or gratitude, but creating conditions where these natural states could flow freely when they arose. The electrical system of this architecture was composed of the various practices that brought energy and illumination to the space. Breathing practices might serve as the basic wiring, providing steady, reliable energy. Gratitude practices might function like lights, illuminating what was working well and worth appreciating. Physical movement might serve as the power source, generating the energy needed to sustain the whole system. The heating and cooling systems involved learning to regulate the internal climatino, forcing particular emotional states, but developing the ability to warm up when life felt cold and distant, or cool down when things became too intense or overwhelming. Morning practice became a laboratory for discovering which practices generated warmth, often connection, movement, or creative activities, and which provided cooling relief, usually stillness, nature, or letting go practices. Like any architecture, this peaceful structure required regular maintenance. Some days called for major repairs when life storms had damaged the usual routines and everything needed to be rebuilt from the foundation up. Other days required only minor adjustments, perhaps changing the timing slightly or adapting the practices to fit different circumstances. The key was developing the skills to assess what type of maintenance was needed and having a toolkit of practices that could address different types of structural issues. The most sophisticated aspect of this peaceful architecture was learning to build structures that could accommodate growth and change. The practice that worked perfectly during one life season might feel too constrictive or too loose during another period. The space that felt ideal in one living situation might not work in a different home. The timing that felt natural during one job might not fit with different work demands. This adaptability required what architects call future-proofing, designing structures that could be modified without destroying their essential integrity. In the case of morning practice, this meant identifying which elements were truly essential, usually time, space, attention, and acceptance, and which elements were variable, specific practices, duration, particular rituals. The essential elements provided continuity and stability, while the variable elements allowed for creativity and responsiveness to changing conditions. The architecture of peace also needed to accommodate other people. While morning practice was fundamentally solitary, it existed within the context of relationships and community. How to maintain personal practice while living with others who had different schedules. How to protect the boundaries of practice time while remaining responsive to genuine emergencies. How to share the benefits of practice without imposing it on others. These questions led to understanding that the architecture of peace wasn't just personal but interpersonal. The stability and clarity cultivated in morning practice became gifts that could be offered to others, not by preaching about the importance of morning routines, but by showing up to relationships and responsibilities from a more centered place. The peace built in solitude became a foundation for more peaceful engagement with the world. Over time, I began to recognize that the architecture of peace extended far beyond formal morning practice. The principles learned in those early hours, creating boundaries, maintaining attention, accepting what arises, adapting to changing conditions, could be applied to designing entire days, weeks, and years that supported inner peace rather than undermining it. This larger architectural vision included designing work schedules that allowed for natural rhythms of energy and rest, creating social calendars that balanced stimulation with solitude, arranging living spaces that supported rather than scattered attention. It meant choosing commitments and relationships that nourished rather than depleted, and learning to recognize when external structures were supporting inner peace and when they were working against it. The ultimate goal of this peaceful architecture wasn't to create a perfect life free from difficulty or challenge, but to build a structure strong enough to hold whatever life brought: joy and sorrow, success and failure, connection and solitude, clarity and confusion. Like a well-designed building that remains standing through various weather conditions, the architecture of peace provided a stable foundation from which to meet life's inevitable changes with greater equanimity and wisdom. Morning practice, in this larger architectural vision, became both the blueprint and the daily construction work for a life designed to support rather than undermine inner peace. Each morning's practice was both a return to sanctuary and a continuation of the building process, strengthening the structure that would house consciousness throughout the day's activities and the year's changes. Epilogue. Carrying the morning. The morning ends, as all mornings must, giving way to the day's increasing momentum and complexity. But something remains: not the specific practices or the physical sanctuary of early hours, but something more subtle and more portable, a quality of presence that was discovered in stillness and can be carried into movement, a peace that was found in silence and can be maintained even in noise. This carrying of the morning is perhaps the most delicate and most important aspect of the entire practice. It's the difference between morning stillness being a temporary escape from life and it being a preparation for more skillful living. It's the difference between peace being a private luxury and it being a gift we can offer to a world that desperately needs more peace. The transition from morning practice to daily activity becomes its own practice, learning to move from the spaciousness of contemplation into the focus of action without losing the essential qualities that were cultivated in silence. This isn't about maintaining the same meditative intensity throughout busy days, which would be both impossible and impractical, but about accessing the underlying stability and clarity that morning practice reveals. I think of this as learning to be bilingual fluent in both the language of being and the language of doing, able to move between them as circumstances require. The morning teaches the language of being: presence, acceptance, patience, wonder. The day requires the language of doing: planning, executing, communicating, solving. The mature practitioner learns to speak both languages fluently and to know which one is most appropriate for each situation. This bilingual capacity transforms how we meet the inevitable challenges that each day brings. When conflicts arise, we can remember the morning lesson of allowing difficult emotions to exist without immediately acting on them. When decisions need to be made, we can access the clarity that emerges from stillness rather than the reactivity that comes from anxiety. When unexpected changes disrupt our plans, we can draw on the flexibility that was practiced in morning acceptance of whatever arose. The morning's gifts don't eliminate difficulty, but change our relationship to difficulty. Challenges still arise, but they're met from a different no from the scattered, reactive mind that sees problems as emergencies, but from the gathered, responsive awareness that recognizes most situations as workable rather than catastrophic. This shift in perspective ripples outward into all our relationships and responsibilities. Family members notice when we respond to stress with presence rather than panic. Colleagues benefit when we bring clarity rather than confusion to collaborative projects. Communities are strengthened when we contribute stability rather than adding to the general anxiety that characterizes so much of modern life. Perhaps most importantly, carrying the morning teaches us about the portable nature of peace. We discover that the sanctuary we create in external space and time actually exists within consciousness itself, that the peace we find in morning stillness is not dependent on perfect conditions, but is an inherent capacity that can be accessed anywhere, anytime we remember to look for it. This doesn't mean that external conditions don't matter. The morning routine, the quiet space, the protected time, all of these remain valuable and worthy of protection. But they serve as training ground for recognizing peace as an inner capacity rather than an outer achievement. Once this recognition is established, peace becomes much more stable and reliable because it's no longer dependent on circumstances arranging themselves perfectly. The practice of carrying the morning also teaches us about influence versus control. We cannot control the weather, the traffic, other people's moods, or countless other variables that affect our days. But we can influence how we meet these variables with presence or reactivity, with curiosity or judgment, with acceptance or resistance. This influence, exercised consistently over time, shapes not only our own experience, but the experience of everyone we encounter. In this way, morning practice becomes a form of service to the world. By developing our own capacity for peace and presence, we contribute to the collective, emotional, and spiritual climate. We become sources of stability in unstable times, sources of clarity in confusing situations, sources of compassion in a world that often seems to operate from fear and scarcity. This service aspect of morning practice helps address one of the common concerns about contemplative practices, that they're self-indulgent or escapist. In fact, the opposite proves true. The more skilled we become at accessing inner peace, the more available we become for the genuine needs of others. The more familiar we become with our own inner weather patterns, the more helpful we can be when others are struggling with emotional storms. The morning practice also plants seeds that bear fruit in unexpected ways throughout our lives. Patience cultivated in early morning stillness appears years later when caring for aging parents. Acceptance practiced with difficult emotions during morning sits proves invaluable when facing major life transitions. The ability to find beauty in simple moments, steam rising from coffee, light changing across walls, birds calling from trees, becomes a reliable source of nourishment during challenging periods. These fruits of practice often surprise us by their timing and their form, we rarely see direct cause and effect relationships between morning practice and afternoon breakthroughs. Instead, the benefits seem to emerge from some deeper soil, as if the morning practice were creating conditions for growth rather than forcing particular outcomes. This mysterious quality of how morning practice bears fruit teaches us about trust in the process rather than attachment to specific results. Trust that showing up consistently will create benefits, even when we can't see or understand exactly how this happens. This trust itself becomes one of the most valuable qualities we can develop, applicable not only to morning practice, but to all the areas of life where we must act without guarantees of particular outcomes. As months and years of morning practice accumulate, we begin to recognize larger patterns and rhythms in our own development. We see how periods of easy, peaceful practice alternate with more challenging times when maintaining the routine requires more effort. We notice how the practice itself evolves, what once felt difficult becoming natural, what once seemed advanced becoming basic, new layers of subtlety and depth revealing themselves as we're ready to engage with them. This long-term perspective helps us develop what I think of as practice patience, the ability to stay engaged with contemplative work even when immediate benefits aren't obvious, even when the practice feels stale or difficult, even when other priorities seem more urgent. This patience is based not on blind faith but on accumulated evidence that consistency in practice creates benefits that couldn't be achieved through sporadic effort or intellectual understanding alone. The practice also teaches us about the relationship between effort and grace. We can show up, create the conditions, maintain the routine. These are within our control, but the deeper transformations that come through practice feel more like gifts than achievements. We can't force insight, can't manufacture peace, can't will ourselves into profound acceptance. These qualities seem to arise naturally when conditions are right, suggesting that practice is as much about receptivity as it is about discipline. This balance between effort and receptivity becomes a template for approaching other areas of life with greater wisdom. In work, we learn to prepare thoroughly, while remaining open to outcomes we couldn't have predicted. In relationships, we learn to offer our best without trying to control others' responses. In creative pursuits, we learn to develop skills while remaining receptive to inspiration. Perhaps the greatest gift of sustained morning practice is the gradual development of what I can only call unconditional friendship with ourselves. Through witnessing the full range of our internal, whether peaceful mornings and agitated ones, clear days and confused ones, times of inspiration and times of emptiness, we begin to understand that our worth doesn't depend on having particular experiences or being in particular states. This unconditional friendship extends naturally outward into our relationships with others. Having learned to accept our own difficult emotions and challenging moments, we become more capable of accepting others' struggles with similar compassion. Having discovered that our own peace doesn't depend on perfect conditions, we become less demanding that others behave in ways that make us comfortable. The morning practice, in this deepest sense, becomes practice for living with an open heart in a world that often seems designed to encourage closing down. It becomes training for maintaining connection in the face of difference, for staying present in the midst of change, for finding hope even in difficult circumstances. This is perhaps why the simple act of rising early to sit quietly in stillness can feel so radical in our current world. It's a declaration that inner life matters as much as outer productivity, that presence is as valuable as achievement, that peace is possible even in chaotic times. It's a daily vote for the possibility that we can live differently, more slowly, more consciously, more connected to what actually matters. The morning, in the end, is not separate from the day but its foundation. It's not an escape from life but a preparation for engaging life more fully. It's not a retreat from the world but a training ground for offering our best gifts to the world. In those quiet hours before dawn breaks and the day's demands begin, we remember something essential about what it means to be human, not just creatures driven by necessity and urgency, but beings capable of presence, wonder, and peace. Each morning offers the same invitation it has offered since the beginning of time, to witness the world's daily renewal and to participate in our own. The sun rises regardless of whether we watch, but when we choose to be present for this daily miracle, something shifts within us. We remember that we too are part of nature's endless cycle of rest and awakening, darkness and light, ending and beginning. The practice of quiet mornings teaches us that peace is not a luxury but a necessity, not a reward we earn after completing all our tasks, but a foundation that makes all tasks more meaningful. It reminds us that in a world obsessed with speed, there is profound value in slowness. In a culture that prizes noise, there is deep wisdom in silence. In times that demand constant doing, there is revolutionary power in simply being. This is the gift we carry from the morning into the day, the knowing that peace is always available, that stillness exists within movement, that clarity can be found even in the midst of confusion. We carry this not as a burden or responsibility, but as a secret source of strength, a hidden well of nourishment that remains full regardless of how much we draw from it. The morning ends, but its essence continues. In the space between breaths during a stressful meeting, we can return to the peace found in dawn's silence. In the moment before responding to a difficult email, we can access the patience learned through watching light slowly fill an empty room. In the pause before reacting to unexpected news, we can remember the acceptance practiced while allowing emotions to arise and pass away like weather patterns across an open sky. This is how quiet mornings change us, not through dramatic transformation, but through gentle, persistent influence, like water slowly shaping stone. Day by day, breath by breath, moment by moment, we become more who we truly are beneath all the roles we play and pressures we carry. We become more present, more peaceful, more capable of meeting whatever arises with grace rather than reactivity. And in becoming more ourselves, we offer something invaluable to a world that desperately needs people who know how to remain calm in storms, how to find hope in darkness, how to touch the eternal in the midst of the temporary. We become proof that another way of living is possible, way that honors both solitude and connection, both being and doing, both the sacred and the ordinary. The morning waits for us again tomorrow, patient as always, ready to offer its gifts to anyone willing to receive them. It asks nothing of us but presence, promises nothing but possibility, and gives everything to those who learn to see the extraordinary hiding within the ordinary moments of each new day. In the end, the practice of quiet mornings is not about perfecting ourselves or escaping our humanity, but about falling in love with the fullness of what it means to be alive, the difficulties and the beauties, the sorrows and the joys, the questions and the mysteries that make up the rich tapestry of human existence. Each morning is an opportunity to begin again, to start fresh, to remember that no matter what happened yesterday or what challenges await tomorrow, this moment right here, right now was sufficient, complete, and full of possibility. The sun rises, the day begins, and we meet it not as victims of circumstance, but as conscious participants in the great adventure of being human, carrying within us the peace we discovered in silence, the clarity we found in stillness, and the love we learned in the gentle practice of beginning each day by simply being present to the gift of being alive. This is the quiet revolution of morning practice, not changing the world through force or noise, but transforming it through the radical act of finding peace within ourselves and offering that peace, moment by moment, to everyone and everything we encounter. In this way, each morning becomes not just the beginning of another day, but the beginning of a more conscious, more compassionate, more connected way of living. The morning has taught us its greatest lesson, that peace is not something we achieve, but something we are. Not something we find, but something we remember. Not something we possess, but something we embody. And in embodying this peace, we become living invitations for others to remember their own capacity for stillness, their own potential for presence, their own inner sanctuary, that remains untouched by the chaos of the external world. The quiet morning continues to call to us, day after day, offering its eternal invitation to step outside the rush of time and into the spaciousness of presence, to move beyond the demands of doing and into the fullness of being, to discover again and again that in the simplest acts, breathing, watching, listening, being, we find everything we need to live with greater wisdom, deeper peace, and more authentic joy. This is the gift that keeps giving, each morning offering itself as teacher, healer, and friend to anyone willing to meet it with open heart and quiet mind. The practice never ends because each day brings new opportunities to remember, to return, to begin again. And in this endless beginning, we find not repetition but renewal, not routine but revelation, not escape but the deepest possible engagement with the mystery and beauty of being alive.